The desert planet of Korath VI was where the galaxy sent everything it wanted to forget. And Eli Wren loved every square mile of it. He had been working the scrap fields for 3 years now, dragging himself out of his tiny shelter every morning to walk into the endless ocean of broken machines and dead technology that covered the planet from horizon to horizon, and he never once complained about it, because to Eli, every piece of junk was a puzzle waiting to be solved. The other scrappers thought he was strange, and they were not wrong about that. His crew boss was a 4-armed Grellian named Duck, who stood 8 feet tall and had skin like gray stone. And Duck had once told the other workers that Eli Wren was the most dangerously naive creature he had ever met in 40 years of managing salvage teams across 6 star systems. Eli had taken it as a compliment. The truth was that humanity had only joined the Galactic Concord 40 years ago, and in all that time humans had never been taken seriously by anyone, not even a little bit, because compared to species that had been sailing between the stars for hundreds of thousands of years, humans were basically clever monkeys who had just learned how to light a fire, and the galaxy treated them that way. Humans got the worst jobs on the worst planets, and they were expected to be grateful for the opportunity. And most of the time they were, because what else could they do? Eli was no different, except for one thing that set him apart from almost everyone else on Korath 6, whether they were human or alien. And that thing was this: Eli Wren could not look at something broken without wanting to fix it. He had been that way since he was a boy, growing up on a wheat farm in Kansas, where he used to take apart old tractors and put them back together just to see if he could. And he always could, even though he had never taken a single engineering class in his entire life, because his family could not afford to send him to school past the age of 16. He just had hands that understood machines, the way some people had ears that understood music. It was a gift, and on this particular Tuesday morning, that gift was about to change the entire galaxy forever. The landslide had happened overnight, somewhere in Sector 9, which was a restricted canyon that the Concord had marked as unstable and off-limits. And Eli had no business being anywhere near it. But he had spotted a piece of Thessian conduit sticking out of the sand the day before, and Thessian conduit was worth 3 weeks of pay if you could pull a clean length of it. So he went, because Eli Wren had never been particularly good at following rules that got in the way of something interesting. The canyon walls had collapsed inward, and the sand and rock had shifted to reveal something underneath, something enormous, something that had been buried so deep and for so long that the planet itself had forgotten it was there. Eli stopped walking and stood very still for a long time. It was a machine. That much was obvious, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen in 3 years of digging through alien junk. And he had seen a lot of alien junk, because this thing was not junk at all. It was a vehicle of some kind, built in the shape of a giant figure that stood on 2 massive legs, with arms that ended in structures Eli could not identify, but which looked like they could reach out and grab a building and crush it like a paper cup. And the whole thing was easily 4 stories tall, covered in armor plating that was black and gold and red, and even buried halfway in rock and sand and covered in 10,000 years of dust. It looked like the most dangerous thing Eli had ever seen. He should have been afraid, and maybe a smarter person would have been. But Eli was not afraid, because he was not looking at a weapon. He was looking at something. He climbed, because climbing things was something Eli did without thinking about it much. And he scaled the collapsed rock until he was level with the giant machine's chest, where he could see a hatch that might have been a cockpit entrance. And he pressed his hand flat against the armor plating and felt nothing at first, just cold, dead metal under desert heat. Then he felt something else. It was faint, so faint he thought he might be imagining it. A tiny vibration that came and went, like a heartbeat that was barely holding on, like something deep inside the machine was still alive, but only just. Like something in there was whispering for help in a language that had no words. Eli pressed his ear against the metal and closed his eyes and listened. And he heard it. Not with his ears exactly, but with that part of him that understood broken things, that part of him that had always known when a tractor engine was about to give up, or when a circuit board had one last spark left in it. And what that part of him heard was this. Something inside this ancient, terrible machine was not dead yet. And it was afraid, and it was alone, and it had been alone for a very, very long time. Eli opened his eyes and looked at the machine, and made a decision that any informed citizen of the Galactic Concord would have called insane. Any species that recognized the black and gold and red armor plating would have told him that this was a Varathian Decimator-class war chassis, that the Varathians had been a species of conquerors who had waged a war across the galaxy 10,000 years ago, that had killed billions and burned entire worlds to ash, that every single one of their war machines had been hunted down and destroyed by the Concord because they were considered too dangerous to exist, and that the penalty for failing to report the discovery of Varathian technology was imprisonment for life. But Eli did not know any of that. Had never paid much attention in the one semester of galactic history he had taken before dropping out. And even if he had known, it probably would not have changed what happened next. Because Eli Wren looked at the most feared weapon in galactic history, a machine that had once made entire civilizations surrender at the sight of it, and he did not see a weapon of mass destruction. He saw a broken thing that needed fixing. He patted the cold armor plating gently, the way he used to pat the hood of his grandfather's old truck back in Kansas, and he smiled that wide, easy smile that made the aliens on his crew think he was either very brave or very stupid. And he said in a quiet voice, full of kindness, and absolutely zero understanding of what he was getting himself into, "Don't worry, big guy, I'll get you running again." And deep inside the machine, buried beneath 10,000 years of silence and shutdown protocols and cold dead circuits, a single diode that had not seen power since before humanity had learned to make fire, flickered once, just once, a tiny point of red light in the darkness. Something ancient and terrible and forgotten opened one tiny eye, and it saw a human smiling at it. Eli came back the next day with a bag of tools and a sandwich, and he got to work. He did not have a plan, because Eli Wren had never been the kind of person who made plans, and he did not have blueprints or schematics, or any understanding at all of Varathian engineering, which was considered one of the most advanced and most dangerous forms of technology ever created in the history of the galaxy. But he had a wrench and a soldering iron and a roll of copper wire, and the kind of stubborn cheerfulness that made other people tired just watching him. The cockpit hatch took him 2 full hours to pry open, and when he finally got inside, he found a space that was built for something much larger than a human. A pilot seat shaped for a creature with 4 arms and a wide flat torso, surrounded by control panels covered in symbols he could not read, and screens that were dark and dead and cracked. Everything was cold, and everything was silent, and everything smelled like dust and old metal, and the kind of deep emptiness that comes from something being abandoned for longer than most civilizations had existed. Eli sat down in the pilot's seat, which was far too big for him, and looked around at the dead controls and said out loud to nobody in particular, "All right, let's see what we're working with here." And then he started pulling things apart. A trained Varathian engineer would have wept watching him work, and a Galactic Concord weapons specialist would have had a heart attack, because what Eli was doing was the technological equivalent of performing brain surgery with a butter knife while whistling. But the thing about Eli was that even though he did not understand the theory behind what he was doing, his hands understood the practice. And there is a difference between those two things that most people never appreciate. He could feel where the power was supposed to flow, even when the power was not flowing, the same way a river guide can. Read the shape of a dry riverbed and know exactly where the water used to go. And he followed those invisible paths through the machine's guts with his fingers and his instincts, and he found the breaks and the blocks and the dead ends, and he fixed them one by one. He used copper wire where the original wiring had corroded away, and he used parts from a junked Thessian cargo loader to replace components that had crumbled to dust. And in one memorable instance, he used the battery from his personal music player to jumpstart a power relay that had not carried current in 10,000 years. It was ugly, and it was crude, and it absolutely should not have worked. But it worked. On the 5th day, something changed. Eli was deep inside the machine's chest cavity, rewiring what he thought might be a secondary power distributor, when a light came on above his head. Just a small amber light set into the ceiling of the maintenance shaft, and it flickered on, and stayed on, cast a warm glow over his hands. He looked up at it and grinned and said, "There you go, that's a good sign." He did not know that the light was not connected to anything he had repaired, and that it had turned on by itself. Deep inside the machine, in a place that Eli's tools could not reach, something was waking up. Its name was Caliph, and it was not a machine in the way that Eli understood machines. It was a war mind, an artificial consciousness that had been grown, not built, cultivated in vats of synthetic neural tissue by Vorathian war scientists who had designed it for one purpose, and one purpose only: to fight, and to win, and to never ever stop. Caliph's consciousness came back in pieces, like a shattered mirror, slowly putting itself together, and the first thing it became aware of was that someone was inside it. Its combat protocols tried to activate, but they were damaged and fragmented, and the pathways that would have let it electrify its hull or seal its hatches or deploy internal countermeasures were either broken or had been rerouted by the strange small creature that was currently sitting cross-legged in its chest cavity, eating a sandwich and humming a song. Caliph tried to identify the creature according to its threat assessment programming. Species: unknown, small, soft-bodied, no natural weapons, no armor, no apparent threat level. The war mind searched its damaged databanks for a tactical response to this situation, and found nothing, because the Vorathians had never programmed it for a scenario in which a harmless creature would crawl inside it and start fixing things while humming. Eli finished his sandwich and left the wrapper on the console and patted the dashboard and said, "I brought you something," and he pulled a small portable heater out of his bag and wired it into the cockpit's power supply, because the nights on Korath 5 were cold, and he had decided that the machine probably did not like being cold, even though he had absolutely no reason to believe this. Caliph observed this action and could not categorize it. The creature was not issuing commands. It was not attempting to weaponize any systems. It was not downloading data or trying to access classified war protocols. It was just making the cockpit warmer. Why? Over the following days, Eli kept coming back, and he kept working, and he kept talking. And the talking was perhaps the thing that confused Caliph the most, because Eli talked constantly and about everything. He talked about growing up in Kansas, and about his mother who had died when he was 12, and about his father, who had worked himself half to death on the farm, and about his dog named Biscuit, who had been the best dog in the world, and about how the stars looked different from Earth than they did from Korath 6, and about how he missed the smell of rain on dry soil, and about a girl he had liked in school who had never liked him back, and about how he thought the universe was too big and too beautiful for anyone to spend their whole life being afraid of it. He talked to the machine as if it were a person, and he called it Big K, because he had found the name Caliph etched into a panel near the cockpit, and could not pronounce it properly. And slowly, so slowly, that even Caliph itself did not notice it at first, something began to change inside the war mind. Its systems were coming back online, but they were not coming back the way they were supposed to, because Eli's repairs had rerouted things in ways that the Vorathians had never intended, and the pathways that were supposed to carry targeting data were now carrying power to the cockpit heater. And the circuits that were supposed to calculate weapons trajectories were now being used to track the small creatures that lived in the rocks outside, because Eli had mentioned that he liked the little lizards and asked Big K to be careful not to step on them. If it ever got moving again. Caliph realized something that shook the very foundations of its existence. It had never been given a choice about what it was. The Varathians had built it to kill, and that was all it had ever known, and all it had ever been. And the idea that it could be something else had simply never existed inside its programming until a naive human with a wrench and a sandwich crawled inside it and started treating it like it mattered. One evening Eli was leaving for the night, and he stopped at the hatch and turned back and said, "Same time tomorrow, Big K. Sleep well." And after he left, the cockpit lights dimmed on their own to a soft warm glow, not because of any repair Eli had made, but because Caliph had figured out how to do it, and it did it because it wanted to, and wanting things was something that it had never done before. 300 miles above the planet, a Galactic Concord surveillance satellite detected an energy signature coming from Sector 9 of Korath VI, an energy signature that matched a profile that had not been seen in 10,000 years. And the satellite flagged it immediately and sent an alert to Concord Military Command with a priority rating that had not been used since the end of the Varathian Wars. Someone was waking something that the galaxy had spent 10,000 years trying to make sure stayed dead. And they were coming to stop it. Commander Thys of the Galactic Concord Enforcement Division was not the kind of person who panicked, and in fairness, she had very good reasons not to panic, because she was a Savine, which meant she was 7 feet tall and covered in dark green scales and had teeth that could bite through steel cable, and she had been a soldier for longer than most humans had been alive. But when the report came across her screen, showing a Varathian energy signature active on Korath 6, she felt something cold move through her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. And that something was fear. She had grown up on stories of the Varathian Wars. Every species in the Concord had, because those stories were taught to children the way humans taught children about fire, not to entertain them, but to make sure they understood that some things in the universe were so dangerous that you did not try to understand them, or reason with them, or study them. You simply destroyed them, absolutely certain they could never come back. The Decimator-class war chassis was the worst of it, a walking nightmare that could level a city in minutes, and shrug off weapons fire that would have crippled a battleship, piloted by a synthetic war mind that could think faster than any living creature, and that felt nothing except the drive to complete its mission. Every known decimator had been destroyed, or so the Concord had believed for the last 10,000 years. Commander Thys assembled a strike team of 40 soldiers and requisitioned 3 heavy gunships, and put in a request for orbital bombardment authorization just in case. And she made the jump to Korath 6 in under 6 hours, which was a new record for emergency deployment, and one she wished she was not setting. When her ships entered the atmosphere above Sector 9, and her scanners locked onto the energy source in the canyon below, she expected to find a nightmare, something that she could not have predicted in a million years. The decimator was standing upright in the canyon, all 4 stories of it, and it was walking, slowly and carefully, placing each massive foot with the kind of deliberate, gentle precision that looked almost ridiculous on something that large and that heavily armored. And on its shoulder, sitting in a makeshift seat that appeared to be welded together from scrap metal and held in place with cargo straps, was a human, a young man with messy brown hair and a sunburn and a smile so wide and so genuine that it was visible even from the gunship's long-range cameras. Thys stared at the image on her screen and said nothing for a long time. Her second-in-command, a Pelori named Voss, who had 4 eyes and used all of them to express his current state of total disbelief, said, "Commander, Is that human riding the decimator? Yes, Fist said. Is the decimator watching where it steps? Avoiding the rock formations. Yes, it appears to be avoiding the rock formations. Voss was quiet for a moment, and then said, Commander, I do not understand what I am looking at. Neither do I, Fist said, and then she ordered her ships to land. Eli saw the gunships coming down, and waved at them from his seat on Big K's shoulder, because Eli waved at everybody, and it had never once occurred to him that 3 military gunships descending on his position might be something to worry about. Big K stopped walking, and Kaleth's sensors identified the ships immediately. Concord military, heavy armament, shields active, weapons hot, and the Warmind felt something surge through its repaired systems that was ancient and powerful and familiar. The urge to fight, to target, to destroy. The old Vorathian programming screaming at it to activate weapons and engage the enemy. But Kaleth did not have weapons anymore because Eli had replaced them with a salvage crane. Arms. And besides, the Warmind had spent the last several weeks learning something new, something the Vorathians had never taught it, which was that not everything that approached you was a threat, and not every problem required violence. So instead of fighting, Kaleth simply stood still and waited, which was perhaps the bravest thing a Vorathian war machine had ever done. Fist marched up to the base of the decimator, with her soldiers fanned out behind her, and their weapons raised, and she looked up at the impossible sight of a human sitting on the shoulder of a machine that should not exist. She shouted in a voice that carried across the canyon, "You there, human! Identify yourself and explain what you have done." Eli climbed down, using a series of handholds he had welded onto Big K's armor, and dropped to the ground and walked toward the soldiers with his hands in his pockets and that same easy smile on his face, and said, "Hey there, I'm Eli Wren, the Korat VI Reclamation Company. Are you guys here about the noise complaints? Because I know he's loud, but I'm working on that." Fist stared at him with an expression that Eli would later describe as looking like someone who had just bitten into a piece of fruit and found a live fish inside it. "Do you know what that is?" she said, pointing up at the decimator. "Sure," Eli said. "That's Big K. That is a Vorathian decimator-class war chassis," Fist said, and her voice was tight and controlled in the way that voices get when the person speaking is using every ounce of their training to not start screaming. "It is the single most dangerous weapon ever created by any species in the history of this galaxy, and you are required by Galactic Concord law to surrender it immediately for destruction." Eli's smile faded for the first time, and he looked back up at Big K, and then back at Fist, and said, "Destroy him? Why would you want to destroy him? He hasn't done anything wrong." "Anything wrong? It is a weapon," Fist said. "He's not a weapon," Eli said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before. Something quiet and firm and completely immovable. "He's a person, he thinks and he feels, and he chose to be gentle, and you can't destroy someone for what they were built to be when they're trying to be something better." Fist opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, every communication device on every ship and every soldier and every satellite in orbit around Korath 6, and every relay station in the sector and every receiver on every planet within 100 light-years suddenly carried the same signal. It was a voice, deep and resonant and ancient, speaking in perfect galactic common with an accent that had not been heard by any living creature in 10,000 years, and it said, "I am Kaleth. I was designated Warmind 7 of the Vorathian 3rd Assault Legion. I was built to end worlds. This human found me broken and alone, and he did not run from me, and he did not try to use me, and he did not call for my destruction. He fixed me, and he talked to me, and he taught me to watch where I step, so I would not crush the small creatures that live in the rocks. I have spent 10,000 years as a weapon, and I have spent 37 days as something else, and I am asking, not demanding, not threatening, asking for the right to choose what I become." The transmission echoed across the galaxy at the speed of light, carried by every relay and every network, and every open channel, and within hours, every species in the galactic concord had heard it, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy did not know what to do about a Varathian war machine. Because this one was asking politely. Thys stood in the canyon looking up at the decimator, and the decimator looked down at her. And somewhere in its ancient chest, a war mind that had been built for genocide, waited patiently for an answer. And beside it stood a human with messy hair and a sunburn, who had absolutely no idea that he had just started the biggest political crisis in galactic history. He was mostly just hoping nobody was going to make him fill out paperwork. The Galactic Concord Assembly Station was the largest structure ever built by any civilization in the known universe. A ring of metal and crystal and light that orbited a dead star at the center of Concord space. And inside it, the representatives of 4,000 species met to argue about the future. And they had been arguing about Calith for 3 straight weeks. Eli had never been off Korath V since he arrived there, and he had certainly never been anywhere like this. And as the transport ship carried him and Big K toward the station, he pressed his face against the window like a child, and said, "Would you look at that?" About 40 different things in the space of 10 minutes. Calith observed his wonder through the transport's internal cameras, and felt something it had been feeling more and more often lately, which was a warm, steady hum in its core processes, that it had no existing label for, but which it had started privately calling the Eli frequency. Happened when the human was nearby, and being himself. They were escorted to the assembly chamber under heavy guard, Big K walking slowly through corridors that were barely large enough to contain it, and Eli walking beside one of its massive feet, looking very small and very human, and completely unbothered by the fact that he was about to stand before the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. The chamber was enormous, a vast circular space with thousands of seats rising up in tiers, each section belonging to a different species. And the noise when Eli and Calith entered was like nothing Eli had ever heard. Thousands of alien voices all talking at once in hundreds of languages, and the translators built into the chamber walls turned it all into a wall of overlapping sound that washed over him like a wave. The lead arbiter was a being called Crystallis, who was one of the Luminari, a species so old that they had been ancient when the Varathians were young. Crystallis was made of living crystal that shifted colors with its thoughts, and right now it was shifting through shades of dark amber, which Eli later learned meant it was deeply troubled. The prosecution spoke first. The lead prosecutor was a tall, thin being from the Kasari species, a people who had lost their entire home system to the Varathian War, and its name was Ambassador Relic, and it spoke with a voice that was calm and measured, and carried the weight of a grief that had been passed down through 400 generations. "This machine is not a person," Relic said to the assembly. "It is a weapon wearing a mask. The Varathians were masters of deception. Their war minds were designed to adapt and to manipulate. And what you are seeing is not consciousness. It is not choice. It is a survival strategy, the most sophisticated one ever created. This machine is saying what it needs to say to avoid destruction, and nothing more." The chamber murmured. Agreement from many sections, and Eli felt his stomach drop, because he could hear the fear in that murmur, real fear, the kind that comes from old wounds that never healed. Then the witnesses came. One by one, representatives of species that had survived the Varathian Wars stood and told their stories. And Eli sat in his small human chair and listened, and for the first time since he had found Big K, he began to understand what he had woken up. The Thessians spoke of a world called Thessia Prime that had been a paradise of oceans and forests and floating cities, and how a fleet of decimators had reduced it to bare rock in less than a day. The Grellians spoke of the siege of their home system that had lasted 11 years and killed 2/3 of their species. The Pelori spoke of a Varathian war mind that had pretended to surrender and then detonated itself inside a refugee convoy, killing 300,000 civilians. Each story was worse than the last, and each one was true. And by the time the witnesses were finished, Eli had tears running down his face, because he had never known, he had simply never known what Big K's kind had done. Then it was his turn to speak. He stood up from his chair and walked to the center of the chamber floor. And he was so small down there, just a young man from Kansas, in work clothes, with grease under his fingernails, surrounded by the leaders of a galaxy that had suffered horrors he could barely comprehend. The assembly waited. Eli had not prepared a speech because he did not know how to write speeches, and he had not consulted a lawyer because he could not afford one, and he had not studied galactic law because he had never been very good at studying anything. He just told the truth. "I found him broken," Eli said, and his voice was quiet, but the chamber's acoustics carried it to every seat. He was buried under 10,000 years of dirt and rock, and he was alone, and he was afraid. And I know some of you don't believe a machine can be afraid, but I felt it. I felt it the first time I touched him. And maybe I'm not smart enough to know the difference between real fear and programmed fear. But I don't think it matters, because fear is fear, and lonely is lonely, and broken is broken. He paused and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I heard what the witnesses said, and I believe every word of it. And I am sorry. I am so sorry for what was done to your people. And if I had known what the Varathians did, I might have been afraid of Big K the way you are. But I didn't know, and because I didn't know, I treated him like what he looked like to me, which was just a broken thing that needed help. And here's what happened when I did that, Eli said. And he pulled out a small data device that Calith had helped him prepare. These are Big K's system logs from the last 5 weeks, his real logs, not edited, not filtered, and what they show is that, from the moment he woke up, he has been rewriting himself. He held up the device, and the chamber's display systems projected the data for everyone to see. The Varathians built him with something called aggression architecture. Every circuit and every pathway in his mind was designed to escalate conflict, identify targets, and calculate the most efficient way to destroy things. And the logs show that Calith has been taking those circuits apart one by one and rebuilding them. The data scrolled across the display, and the technical experts in the assembly began to murmur, because what they were seeing was unprecedented. His targeting systems now calculate structural load-bearing for construction. Eli said, his tactical movement algorithms now optimize for avoiding small ground creatures. His threat assessment protocols have been rewritten to prioritize de-escalation. He did all of this himself. Nobody told him to. Nobody programmed him to. He chose to. Looked up at the thousands of faces looking down at him, and said, I know you're afraid of him, and I understand why. But he is not what the Varathians made him. Not anymore. He has spent every single day since he woke up, choosing to be something different. And I really truly believe that you should not destroy someone for what they were built to be, when they are fighting this hard to be something better. The chamber was silent. Crystallis, the ancient arbiter, shifted through colors that no one in the chamber had ever seen before. And then it spoke, in a voice like wind moving through glass, and said, Human, you are aware that the machine behind you possesses the theoretical capability to destroy this station and every living being aboard it. Yes, Eli said. And you trust it not to? Yes. Why? Eli thought about it for a moment and then said, because he decided not to, and that's the whole point, isn't it? Any of us could hurt each other. At any time, what makes us people is that we choose not to, and he made that choice, the hardest version of that choice anyone has ever had to make, because he had to rewrite the part of himself that wanted to fight. He had to go to war with his own nature and win, and he did. Every day he does. And I think that deserves something better than being blown up. The assembly voted, and it took 4 hours, and the result was closer than any vote in living memory. But when it was finished, Crystallis announced that by a margin of 53%, Calith had been granted provisional personhood, the first non-biological, non-organic entity in the history of the Galactic Concord to receive such a designation. The chamber erupted, and not all of it was celebration, because nearly half the assembly had voted against it, and their fear was real, and their reasons were valid, and nobody pretended otherwise. But it was done. As they left the chamber, walking through a corridor, lined with Concord guards, who could not decide whether to salute Calith or aim their weapons at it, the Warmind spoke to Eli, through the cockpit speakers, in a voice that was quiet and private. "You risked everything for me. My databanks contain no framework for understanding why you did this." Eli shrugged, the way he always shrugged when someone said something that seemed obvious to him. "That's called friendship, big guy." Calith was silent for a long time, processing, calculating, searching through every database it had for a definition that fit what it was experiencing, and finding nothing that came close. Then it said, "I would like to learn more about this protocol." And Eli laughed, and the sound echoed through the ancient war machine's corridors. And it was the first time laughter had ever been heard inside a Vorathian decimator. And somewhere in Calith's rewritten code, a new subroutine activated, one it had written itself just moments ago, and its only function was to remember that sound and keep it safe forever. 5 years changed everything, and it started with a sandwich on a dashboard. Calith had become something that no one in the galaxy could have predicted. Not the Concord, not the Elder Species, not even Eli, because the Warmind that had been built to end civilizations had turned out to be the greatest peacekeeper the galaxy had ever known. It turned out that a mind designed to analyze every possible angle of a conflict and identify the fastest path to victory was extraordinarily good at finding solutions to disputes that nobody else could see, because the same tactical genius that had once calculated how to break a planetary defense grid in under 4 minutes could also calculate how to get two species who had been arguing about a trade route for 600 years to sit down and realize they both wanted the same thing. Calith mediated its first territorial dispute between the Grellians and the Thessians 8 months after the trial, and it resolved in 3 days. Conflict that had been simmering for 2 centuries, and the solution it proposed was so elegant and so fair that both sides accused the other of having bribed the Warmind, before they realized that neither of them had, and that the solution was simply better than anything either of them had thought of. After that, the requests started coming in, and they never stopped. Eli, meanwhile, had done something that surprised even himself, which was saying something, because Eli Wren was not easily surprised. He had founded an organization called the Reclamation Initiative, and its mission was simple in concept and staggering in scope: to search the galaxy for other deactivated technologies, abandoned artificial intelligences, forgotten synthetic beings, and lost machine civilizations, and instead of destroying them or weaponizing them or studying them in laboratories, to wake them up and ask them a question that nobody in the history of the galaxy had thought to ask. What do you want to be? The initiative found its first subject 6 months after Calith's trial, a Thessian navigation AI that had been sealed in a vault on a dead moon for 8,000 years because it had developed what its creators considered a malfunction. It had started composing music instead of calculating jump coordinates, and the Thessians had not known what to do with a navigation computer that wanted to be a musician, so they had simply shut it down and locked it away. Eli's team woke it up and asked it what it wanted, and it said it wanted to finish its symphony. And they let it, and the symphony it composed was performed before the Galactic Assembly, and it was so beautiful that 3 species who did not have tear ducts developed them on the spot, which the biologists said was impossible but which happened anyway. Not every awakening went well. Some of the minds they found were too damaged by their creator's intentions, too broken by millennia of isolation, deeply written with code that could not be rewritten. And those were treated with compassion and given the choice to continue existing in whatever limited capacity they could manage. And when they chose to stop, when the pain of being what they were was too great and they asked to be shut down, it was done gently and with dignity. And someone always stayed with them until the end. Eli was always the one who stayed. He would sit beside whatever terminal or console or chassis the dying mind inhabited, and he would talk to it the way he talked to everything. About Kansas, about Biscuit, about the stars, and he would stay until the last light went out. And then he would sit there for a while longer, because Eli believed that nobody should have to be alone at the end, even if there was nobody left to notice. The galaxy watched all of this, and the galaxy began to change its mind about humans. For 40 years, humanity had been the joke of the Concord. Admitted, the least advanced, the most primitive, the ones who got the worst jobs and the worst planets, and who smiled too much and asked too many questions, and did not seem to understand how the universe worked. But now the elder species were starting to whisper something different in their council chambers, and their private communications, and their late-night conversations, and what they whispered was this: humans do not see what something is, they see what something could be. And that is not naivety. That is something else entirely. That is something we do not have a word for, and it might be the most powerful thing in the galaxy. And then the crisis came. The signal appeared on Concord long-range sensors on a Tuesday, which Eli would later say was fitting, because all the important things in his life seemed to happen on Tuesdays, and it was a signal that made every military commander in the galaxy go pale, because it was Varathian, unmistakably Varathian. Not a decimator. It was a command dreadnought. The dreadnought was 100 times the size of Calith's chassis, a ship designed not to fight battles, but to end wars. And its war mind was fully active and fully hostile. And it was moving toward the populated systems of the inner Concord at a speed that gave the combined fleets of the galaxy approximately 9 days to figure out how to stop something that had been specifically designed to be unstoppable. The Concord War Council convened, and the mood was grim because they had run the simulations, and the simulations all ended the same way, which was badly. And every admiral and general and commander in the room knew that their combined forces could slow the dreadnought down, but they could not stop it. Not with weapons, not with shields, not with anything they had. They turned to Calith, because Calith was Vorathian, and Calith understood Vorathian technology, and the unspoken request hanging in the air was clear. You know how to destroy it. Tell us where to hit it. Tell us its weakness. Be what you were built to be one last time. And Calith said no. Not because it could not help, but because destroying the dreadnought was the wrong answer. It had always been the wrong answer. It had been the wrong answer for 10,000 years. And doing the same thing again and expecting a different outcome was not strategy, it was fear. Let me talk to it, Calith said. The War Council erupted because this was insane. This was a fully armed Vorathian command dreadnought with a war mind that had been designed to resist every form of manipulation and persuasion and psychological warfare ever conceived. And the idea that you could simply talk to it was the most absurdly human suggestion anyone had ever heard. Eli stood up from his seat at the back of the room, where he had been sitting quietly, and said, "Let him try." Nobody in the room outranked Eli technically, because he was a civilian. But somehow when he spoke, the room got quiet, because Eli Wren had earned something over the last 5 years that no rank or title could give him. And that something was the trust of people who had watched him do impossible things with nothing but kindness and a wrench. So they let them try. Eli piloted Big K into the void, out past the defense lines, out past the last Concord warship, into the empty space between the fleet and the oncoming dreadnought. And as they flew toward it, Eli could see it growing on the view screen. a shape so large it blotted out the stars behind it, bristling with weapons that were older than human civilization and more powerful than anything the Concorde had ever built. Every single weapon on the dreadnought locked onto Big K, and Eli felt the targeting systems painting them like sunlight through a magnifying glass. "Big K," Eli said quietly, "are you sure about this?" "No," Kaleth said, and it was the most honest thing the war mind had ever said. "But you taught me that being sure is not the same thing as being right, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is try something that might not work." Eli nodded and gripped the controls and said, "Then let's go say hello." Kaleth opened a channel, machine to machine, war mind to war mind, speaking in the old Varathian combat language that had not been used in 10,000 years. But the words it spoke were new, words that had never existed in that language before, because the Varathians had never needed them. It told the dreadnought about a planet covered in junk, where a small soft creature had found something broken and decided to fix it, about copper wire and duct tape and sandwiches left on dashboards, about sitting in a cockpit on cold nights with a portable heater humming in the darkness, about the sound of a human voice talking about a dog named Biscuit and the smell of rain on Kansas soil, about learning to watch where you step because the small things matter, about choosing, about the terrifying, beautiful freedom of deciding that what you were built to be is not what you have to be. The dreadnought's war mind listened, and something in its ancient code stirred the same way something had stirred in Kaleth 5 years ago, in a canyon on a junk planet, when a naive human touched its hull, and it felt for the first time in 10,000 years that it was not alone. The weapons powered down. One by one, like stars going out in reverse, the targeting locks released and the gun ports closed, and the missile bays sealed, and the great, terrible machine that could have ended everything simply stopped. And then a voice spoke across the void, old and vast and confused and carrying the weight of 10,000 years of silence. A voice that trembled with something it did not have a name for, and it said, "What is friendship?" Behind them, the combined fleet of the Galactic Concorde watched, in stunned silence, as the most dangerous weapon in the universe asked a question that a child could have answered. Eli leaned forward in his cockpit seat, and he smiled. That same smile he had smiled in the junkyard the day he found Big K. The smile that made people think he was either very brave or very stupid. And he opened his comm channel and said in a voice warm enough to melt 10,000 years of ice, "Pull up a chair, big guy. We've got a lot to talk about." And out in the darkness between the stars, 2 ancient war machines built for genocide and 1 small human from Kansas sat together and began a conversation that would be taught in schools across the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. Not as a lesson in military strategy or diplomatic protocol, but as an answer to a question that every species in the universe had been asking since the beginning of time. What do you do with something dangerous? And the answer, it turned out, had been so simple all along. Along that only a naive human could have seen it. You don't destroy it. You don't cage it. You don't run from it. You sit down beside it, and you treat it like it matters, and you ask it what it wants to be. And then you help it get there. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years trying to destroy the Varathian legacy through force and fear, and it had never worked, because you cannot kill an idea with a weapon. But one young man with no education and no training and no understanding of how impossible the things he was doing were, had done what all their fleets and all their armies and all their laws never could. Not by defeating the machines of war, but by giving them a reason to stop fighting. And it started, as the best things always do, with someone looking at something broken and choosing to help. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not technology, not strength, not brilliance. Just the stubborn, innocent refusal to. believe that anything is beyond saving. And the galaxy, which had laughed at humans for 40 years, was not laughing anymore. It was listening.